Hey everyone, Dockwell here, and welcome to another one of my Dota 2 hero guides. Today we're going to be taking a look at Dragon Knight. So Dragon Knight is a hero who used to be mainly a mid laner and then kind of transitioned to more of an off lane role over the past few years, like a lot of different heroes have. And then in the recent changes with passives and facets, he actually has been largely played as a carry recently, but you can still kind of play him in every single one of those core roles. It's just that carry is the most popular one currently, so we're going to be focusing on that version of Dragon Knight because it is the most unique and the most different compared to his old style. And really the only difference these days between the mid or off lane version of Dragon Knight and the new carry version is that those mid or off lane positions like to buy Blink Dagger and initiate fights, whereas the carry version of Dragon Knight really just focuses on the right clicks and being more like a Medusa or another kind of ranged carry hero that sits in fights and does a lot of damage and is extremely tanky. But overall, Dragon Knight is just an extremely tanky strength hero who's very ultimate focused. So in a lot of ways, you can actually think of him similar to an alchemist, a very tanky hero who has a stun and just really only wants to fight during his ultimate. But unlike an alchemist who just likes to farm for, 15-20 minutes, DK doesn't really need to have a lot of farm, to have a lot of impact. Just with one item and his ultimate alone, he can impact fights, he can push towers early. So the main thing you're going to be wanting to focus on as carry DK is how much do you focus on farming versus how much do you get involved early on with your team to fight, to protect towers, and to push towers. That's really the balance of carry DK. But also knowing that if you do go late game, if you get your 3, 4, 5 items, you will hit like a truck and you'll be very, very hard to bring down, and you'll be a formidable carry into that late game portion. But before we can understand how to play DK, we have to take a look at his abilities. Now for DK's passive and facets, the old way DK worked was you would have a passive that you would put points into that would get you tankier by giving you armor and HP regen. But now that's just built into the hero in general with his just innate passive. So you don't really need to put points into that. And now what you're putting points into with this passive is basically one of these three things that you have to choose from. Where in the past, every time you leveled up your Elder Dragon form, you would get one of these three and then they would all stack on top of each other. So because of that shift in balance, it kind of changes the dynamic of the hero, which has allowed this hero to become a carry. So basically, as carry DK, you're always going to be picking Fire Dragon. Now in the future, when they balance it, maybe you could pick Corrosive Dragon or something like that, but the reason why this is so good for carry DK is because it gives you a free Battle Fury. Kind of makes you a Sven whenever you put points into this passive ability. So you just get this free cleave, you're farming way quicker. That's just always going to lend itself to a carry version of the hero. I mean, maybe there could be a carry version that gets one of these two, but that's probably going to be more for like the mid or off lane version if those do get buffed in the future at some point. So basically the difference between these three is the Fire Dragon gives you cleave, this one gives you corrosive power, basically damage over time, and this one gives you a slow. And then the dragon form does amp up those things, but you mainly get them from leveling your passive. And obviously we'll take a look at that when we look at the abilities more, but that's kind of just the basics of these three. It's not really too complicated. And like I said, for the carry one, you're almost always going to be picking this. Even if it changes or gets buffed differently, that's probably just the nature of these facets, is this is what's going to happen almost no matter what, unless one of these become broken. Now, Dragon Knight's abilities are all pretty easy to understand. First, we have Breathe Fire. It's a pretty simple ability. Basically, you see the AoE there, and if I press it in a direction, you just breathe fire in that direction, and you do damage in an AoE. And you can see the axe took damage. This is great for pushing creep waves, for getting last hits, for farming the jungle. It's just an easy and straightforward ability, doing damage in the early game, that kind of early burst magic damage. But the other thing that it does that is a little bit underrated and really, really important is the damage reduction on right clicks. This is good for just being tankier when you're farming the jungle, but it's especially good for trading in the lane. As long as you're hitting the enemy core with this, that's great because now you're just going to outlast them almost every single time, and you're going to outtrade them if you do try to fight that enemy hero, and you're getting that passive that is just making you tankier. So it's great early on in the lane, especially for leveling it up. I mean, later on it's great for doing damage and things like that. That damage reduction later on is also really good, but in the laning stage especially, and for that early farm, this is a very essential ability. Then we have Dragon Tail, and this is another easy to understand ability. Basically, you see the AoE there. It's pretty small. You have to walk right up to the enemy hero, click it on them, and then they get stunned for a decent duration. So this is a pretty long and good stun to have on a carry hero, but just know that obviously you have to walk right up to them, or it has a very long range that you can easily dodge as an enemy when you are in your Elder Dragon form, but I'll show you that in a minute. Then we have Worm's Wraith, and this is the ability that I talked about in conjunction with those facets. Whenever you level this up, you get that facet, which is really good for farming the jungle as a carry when you do pick the red one. The other ones are good as well in other situations, but you only get them when you level this up. So it's a matter of, you know, how much do I want to level up Breathe Fire? Do I want to put a point in Dragon Tail? How much of this passive do I actually need? I'm getting tanky regardless every time I level up. So it's a little bit of a consideration there with this hero. But otherwise, these abilities are pretty straightforward. And then the ultimate is also really straightforward. You just press this and you turn into a dragon, and now you become a ranged hero. So that's really good for just in general being a carry that is tanky strength, but then also becomes range. That's pretty unique in the game. And you just can obviously do range right-click damage, and you buff up the hero in general. You get move speed, attack range, attack damage. You also amp up this effectiveness of this passive, which is also really good. And then the other big thing is this Dragon Tail ability becomes ranged now. So you can actually use it from a decent distance. The thing is, this is an ability that takes some time to come out, so you can kind of see it shooting out at the enemy and hitting them. So they do have the ability to disjoint or dodge it and maybe press BKB. So it's not always the most reliable stun, but if you do land it on the enemy, you can get a ton of damage in. And obviously with your Breathe Fire and those kinds of things and your right clicks, it can be very, very effective at isolating and killing heroes. So that's really DK for the most part. I mean, he does have an Ags that used to be a lot better. Now it's not as good as it once was. This makes you a black dragon. So when you are leveled up to max, let's just level to max, and you click this, now you're a black dragon. You can actually fly over cliffs and trees and stuff. You have free pathing, which is really, really good for like hitting high ground fights or just dodging and weaving in and out of fights. It makes you tankier in general. It's just a great thing to have, but it's not as good as it once was. Then the other thing is the Shard. The Shard is good for farming, but because you already have this passive now, they've changed this around a little bit. I don't think this Fireball is that good for farming anymore. It's also not that great for harassing anymore. It used to be pretty good, but they've nerfed it a lot. So basically it's just a Fireball that goes into AoE and kind of just sits there and burns targets and burns creep waves. It's not the worst thing of all time, obviously, but it was better in the past. I think they will change it into the future, like I said, so it's not the biggest deal these days. But yeah, that's DK. Those are his abilities. Now let's jump into a game and see how he's played. So DK's laning stage is really all about using Breathe Fire to harass the enemy and secure last hits. That damage reduction is so good for trading with the enemy and securing all those denies, and it just is very annoying for the enemy to get hit by this Breathe Fire. And then once you level it up, it's actually a pretty significant nuke early on in the game. Now some, offlaners won't really care too much, but supports, especially early on, once they hit level 4, 5, 6, they don't have much HP, and this Breathe Fire is a pretty low cooldown spell that can absolutely destroy supports. So it's definitely a really, really good spell early on. It's the main consideration and the main thing you're going to be using in the laning stage. And then it's just about how tanky do you really feel? Like, how good is the matchup that you're against? Some matchups, maybe like a Viper or something, you have to be very, very careful against certain matchups, but other matchups, you can get super aggressive. You can get a point in stun or two and just absolutely mow down the enemy hero. But for the most part, you're just going to get 1 point in stun at the most, and then level your passive so that you can farm the lane, push it out, and farm jungle pretty quickly, especially as a carry. Then once DK hits level 6, you really want to be using your ultimate off cooldown. Like, as soon as you get it, you can use it. If it's a good opportunity to push the tower, use it for that. If you just want to farm the creep wave, push out the wave and farm the neutral camps, you can definitely do that. It's one of those things where you don't really want to be waiting around to use it. It doesn't make you a ton tankier like maybe an alchemist would. It does increase your damage, but it's not crazy like a Sven. But even these days with Sven and CK and these other ultimate focus carries that a lot of times are strength carries, they still want to be using their ultimate off cooldown as much as possible early game and not waste that time that they can amp up their damage and farm. And so that's the same thing with DK. Use your ultimate as much as possible, and just know that when you do have that short period where it is on cooldown, you don't want to fight, you want to be a little bit more passive, but you definitely want to be using it as much as possible to push towers, fight with your team if you have that point in stun, and farm quicker, because it does, give you that ability to farm a little bit quicker. It's not amping it up like crazy, but it is amping it up enough that it does make a significant difference. Then mid-game is really going to be about finding that balance between farming and fighting or pushing with your team when your ultimate is up. Because DK is not one of those heroes that's straightforward in terms of like Alchemist or Medusa, or one of these heroes where it's like, okay, I just want to farm, I definitely want to get my items, I'm an AM or a PA, I'm getting my Battle Fury, it's really, really important, I'm only going to show up to the most advantageous fights or if it's right next to me. DK is not really like that. DK, the ultimate is so good, the pushing power is so good that you do want to show up to fights. You do have a decent stun. You can participate early. You are extremely tanky early. So it's not one of those things where you just want to be AFK. If your team can use your help, you want to show up, but you don't want to show up to every single fight, to every engagement, and feed and then not farm enough, because DK is one of these heroes that if you do get to your 3, 4, 5 items, you are extremely hard to bring down and you do a ton of damage. So that's why this hero is being played as a carry, because it can do that. So that's why you want to have that balance between showing up to fights, pushing towers, and farming. It can be a tricky balance on a hero like DK where it's not always straightforward to know which one to do. Then late game, you can think of yourself more like a ranged carry than a melee strength hero. DK is extremely tanky, of course, but in that way you function more like a Medusa. You want to sit there, and if you're able to hit the tower and siege it, if you're able to hit enemy heroes, you will absolutely shred them when you get your items. But you don't want to be this initiation. You don't want to be in the front line just, tanking everything, because you don't have a great get out of jail free card. So you're not going to like pop your ultimate like a Medusa and be able to run away or anything like that. You might get BKB, of course, but you do have to be wary of getting bursted, especially if the enemy has a break, or getting kited a lot. So it's kind of this dance that you're playing where you're not like a Drow Ranger or something where you're sitting way in the back and you're not super far forward, even if you have Aegis, because if you, let's say, have your ultimate running, you have Aegis, but if you get killed, now you don't really have your ultimate. You're in a very precarious position. So that's the balance to strike with DK, is how far forward do you sit? How far back do you sit? You don't want to get kited. You want to be able to hit, but you're not going to tank every single thing in the game. It's like this very, where exactly are you supposed to be in the fights? It's very matchup dependent. It's very situationally dependent. You're not going to be initiating fights usually either as DK, because you're not going to be buying blink, and your stun isn't always that reliable. So the stun is more of something where you either counter initiate or you follow up on a teammate stun. So it is a lot about playing around your teammates. But if you are able to hit the enemy, if you are able to hit the towers with that 4 or 5 items, you are going to delete the enemy. So that's kind of how to think about fights and thinking about late game DK. How does that really work? Then the last two things I would say is just, I kind of already mentioned both of them, but just be very wary of breaks. Breaks are the main way you're going to get countered later in the game. Obviously the biggest one is Viper. Viper strikes you. That's going to be very bad. But there's a lot of breaks in the game these days. So you have to be wary of that, because your passive is so good. It makes you so tanky. If all that armor and all that HP regen is gone, you actually can get bursted on this hero, because you're not always buying a ton of HP items. You're really relying on that passive to be tanky, and then you're buying a lot of damage items as the carry. So that's the first thing you really need to be wary of. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that don't count out Breathe Fire. It's not going to do a ton of damage later on in the game. That burst is more for the early game, for the laning stage, for farming, but don't count out that damage reduction, especially if you're fighting the carry, because if they already use Manta, if they already use their abilities or their items that purge themselves, you can use it a little bit later on after they've used all those things, and then minus 30% damage reduction on their attacks is a lot. That can actually be the difference in the fights, and people aren't really thinking about those things later on in the game as much. There's a lot to think about in fights, and if you can get that, enemy right clicker with that debuff, that can really shift the balance of power in those fights, even though if it's a small little thing people aren't thinking of. So just be wary of that, be cautious of that, or understanding of those two things, because that can be the difference in fights whether you win or lose. And that, everyone, is my Dragon Knight guide. If you liked the video or found it helpful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.